Hi, welcome to the podcast. This topic, we're going to talk about the variable overhead variances, how we quantify them and what they mean. So let's go through kind of the definitions. The first variance that we have is really the variable overhead flexible budget variance. And you can see here that it is the difference between our actual variable overhead and our flexible budget amount. So this is the amount of variance that is caused by something other than volume. Because you remember, the actual amount and the flexible budget are both built on the same final units of production or final units sold, depending on what we're looking at. And this is kind of a snapshot of that. So this section right here is our flexible budget variance. It's actually the same as this bigger piece. And again, it's the difference between the actual amount and the flexible budget amount. And as you can see where we're going to break that out in between a spending variance and an efficiency variance. And that's very similar to what we did with the other direct costs, where we had spending or price variances and efficiency or usage variances. So let's kind of define how we arrive at those more refined, higher level variances. So the variable overhead efficiency variance is the difference between the actual quantity of cost allocation basis used and the budgeted quantity of cost per unit of the allocation base. So here's our efficiency variance. And again, remember, when we're kind of the underlying idea with variances is we're trying to hold one variable constant so we can see the effect of the change in the other variable. In this case, the variable we're holding constant is the budgeted overhead cost. So we're holding spending constant, so that rate is going to be constant, and we're looking to see what is the difference in the quantity, because that's how efficiently we used the product. So we know how much we actually used, and we compare that to how much we should have used based on that level of volume. The spending variance, very similar. In this case, we're trying to see what the change is caused by the change in what we thought was cost us versus what it actually cost us. So in this case, the variable that we hold constant is the actual quantity used to make the output. And what we then compare so that's the constant. So then the variable becomes, what did we actually spend versus what did we think we were going to spend. Okay, and so that's, again, the efficiency variance explains some of the flexible budget variance, and the spending variance explains some of the flexible budget variance. Okay, so back to our example that we've been using. We actually produced 10,000 jackets, and so our flexible budget would also be built on 10,000 jackets. Our budget was for 0.4 machine hour per jacket, but it was actually 0.45. So we multiply that, and we know that we used 4,500 machine hours instead of 4,000. We know our variable overhead cost, actual and flexible budget, and of course that we've already defined that in a previous podcast of what our total overhead variance is, our variable cost overhead variance. So we can then figure out the variable cost per machine hour. And so we take the total actual, the 130,500, divided by the actual machine hours, and we come up with a rate of $29. And we had already calculated again in a previous podcast the $30 an hour. And so, by the way, we can immediately look at that and see we're going to have a positive or favorable spending variance. We spent less per machine hour than we thought we were going to spend. All right. But then what was our overhead cost per output? Well, in this case, we take our total cost and divided it by the output. and you can see that that cost ended up being more. So we know that we're going to have an offset with that variance. So let's take a look at these. So again, our flexible budget variance is the difference between the actual variable overhead cost and the flexible budget cost. And so we have an unfavorable variance of 10,500. I think I said that we looked at this earlier. No, that might not be true. I might just been thinking when I was creating these. So I think this is probably where we first recognize that. So the total overhead budget variance, if I go back to here, the flexible budget variance in this case is 10,500 unfavorable, the difference between those two. Okay, so let's look at the efficiency variance. So we know the constant is our $30 per hour. So what varies? The actual hours used, 4,500, versus how many hours we should have used to make 10,000 units. And in this case, that's that 0.4 times 10,000, or as you can see here, 4,000. And so our efficiency variance is 15,000 unfavorable. Spending, in this case, we're using the actual machine hours, so we're holding that level constant and seeing what the difference in costs was. We already had calculated from that previous slide $29 per machine hour versus $30 per machine hour, and so in this case we had a spending variance that was favorable. And so we put those together with our level 2 and level 3 analysis, and so the 10,500 unfavorable flexible budget variance is explained by a 15,000 unfavorable efficiency variance and a 4,500 favorable spending variance. And again, kind of related, we saw something like this with direct materials. With direct materials, I made sort of an assumption that, well, maybe the materials we bought were less expensive, but they weren't as high quality, so we weren't as efficient using them. It's a little bit harder to define that when it comes to variable overhead, because overhead is a lot of different things. It's not just material. But this could easily be caused by a similar thing. We used something less expensive. We hired a cheaper janitorial service. We bought cheaper toilet paper or something like that. And so we have this favorable spending variance, but they weren't as fast cleaning, or we went through the product much quicker, and so our efficiency was unfavorable. Okay, so that takes us through the variable cost overhead variances, and when we conclude this chapter, we'll be talking about the fixed cost overhead variances.